Hi guys, I'm back with another video today. And today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite cartoons ever, SpongeBob SquarePants. Specifically, one of the characters from it. He's well known for being SpongeBob's boss at the Krusty Krab and a cheapskate. Very cheap. It's Mr. Krabs. Full name Eugene H. Krabs. And specifically, we're going to be talking about how cheap he really is, so much so that he's willing to commit crimes. Yeah, believe it or not, he is so cheap and he goes to such extreme measures to be cheap that he has actually committed various crimes. It's actually quite an extensive list that I found on the Villains Wiki. So I saw that list and I'm like, I wonder how long he would go to jail for, or like what kind of punishments he would get for it. So I'm deciding to do that today because I couldn't find it anywhere, honestly. So that's what I'm doing now. That's what I figured out over the past 3 weeks. It took a lot longer than I thought it was going to do, and also I got busy with stuff like there was family stuff that I had to do. But yeah, I finally got it done. Sorry to keep you guys waiting. Thanks for being patient. But yeah, a few things before we start. I'm not a lawyer. I don't have a law degree. I'm not a professional. All I did was literally Google this stuff. So it's very likely to not be entirely correct, but that's fine. I just kind of want to get a close estimate. Also, I used sentences from various states across the United States, and I did use U.S. law for this. So this might not be entirely consistent, but it should, like I said, give a general idea of how much time he should go to jail for. All right, with that out of the way, let's start with the first thing, which is theft. Now, I think this is from the episode where he steals the pearl from the oyster, but it actually turns out to be an egg because it's free day, which is only supposed to apply to commercial products like toys or like balloons or whatever. But he ends up stealing the pearl because like it's free day, everything's free. Not. But yeah, so this one was a little kind of hard to do starting off because you kind of have to like evaluate the price of the oyster egg. But the thing is that oyster eggs aren't really valuable in like real life society. So what I did was I ended up treating it like an actual like pearl, like what he intended to steal, because if he knew it was an oyster egg, he wouldn't have stolen it. He thought it was a pearl. So I treated it as such. And I gave it about a value of like $1,500. So for his sentence, his punishment, he would be getting, let's see here. I have it written down. If you see me looking off to one direction here, that's because I have my phone up and I'm looking at this because there's way too much to remember. So sorry if I'm not looking at the screen entirely. Like, it's not like I don't want to look at my precious 7 viewers that I have at the time of making this. But, I just got to kind of read off. But anyways, so he would be getting 3 years of jail time and, for the sake of equality, $1,500 of charges. So starting off, that's not that good. But this is just the top of the iceberg. There is way more to come, believe me. I was surprised at how long the list was. But anyways, the next thing is fraud. So this is just like a general fraud charge because it wasn't very specific of like, oh, is it insurance fraud, bank fraud, tax fraud, whatever. So I'm just treating it as a general fraud charge, which this would get him 20 years of jail time and $10,000 in fines. So, yeah, that's kind of not good. It's just going to get worse and worse as we go down the list. So, the next thing we have is assault. This is pretty simple. 1 year in jail and an $1,000 fine. Next up, we have scamming. Scamming would get you. Well, before I say what it gets them, this one was kind of interesting, I suppose, because scamming, like, itself, I don't think it's illegal, but like I said, I'm not a lawyer, so don't take my word as law, literally. Um, but online scamming is, so I decided to treat it as that instead of fraud because we already have fraud. So this would get him 3 years in jail and another $10,000 fine. Next up, We have blackmail, which is another simple one. This would result in 12 years in prison and a $5,000 fine. Next up, we have psychological abuse. I told you he did some pretty bad stuff. Yeah. This would most likely be a first-degree misdemeanor charge, which would result in half a year in jail and a $1,000 fine. Next up, we have money laundering. This is a pretty big one. He would receive 20 years in jail, and I think this is the largest fine on the list. $500,000 worth of fines. Like, that is $500,000 worth of fines, which is a lot. Next up, we have trespassing. This one isn't really a lot. It's probably the smallest charge on the list, I would say. It's just 1 month in jail and a $250 fine. Next up, we have grave robbing, which I knew exactly what this came from. If you don't, you're not a real SpongeBob fan. And if you don't know, it's the episode where Mr. Krabs goes into the graveyard to get the soda hat that he thinks is really valuable from Smitty Weber Jaegerman Jensen, but then it turns out to be worthless. Classic episode, amazing, very funny. But for doing this, he would receive 3 months in prison and a $500 fine. Next up, we have animal cruelty, which I think this is referring to the episode where he captured all the jellyfish, or rather made SpongeBob capture all of them in order to get enough jelly for his jelly patties. This would get him a year in prison and $2,500 in fines. Next up, we have attempted and forced suicide, which is wild, honestly. Like, it's very wild. And I'm not very sure what this is talking about, and trying to find a charge for it was a little difficult. I think I just ended up going with, like, attempted suicide, like, aiding and attempting suicide. But it would end up getting him 7 years in prison and a $14,000 fine. Next up, we have tax evasion. Which, classic charge, big meme. Yoshi going for tax evasion, now Mr. Krabs going for tax evasion. This would be 5 years in prison and a $100,000 fine. Fun fact about tax evasion. Did you know that Larry the Cucumber from VeggieTales evades his taxes too? Because in one episode, a guy from the IRS comes to collect from him, and he just slams the door in his face. So, yeah, a lot of cartoon characters and video game characters commit tax fraud. Very cool. Next up, we have selling souls, which this one was very interesting because selling souls is a very legally gray kind of place, because it's not legal, but it's not legal for a reason where it's like, oh, that's not the proper, like, seller's contract or whatever, where it's like you're not getting an actual, like, legitimate item or whatever. Like, it's not illegal because you're selling a human part. It's illegal for just, like, improper conduction of the trade or sell or whatever you want to call it. So for this, I actually ended up treating it like as if he sold, like, actual, like, human body parts, like an arm or a leg or a heart or a spleen or a kidney or whatever, for, like, non-medical purposes or non-study purposes, like black market kind of stuff. This would be 5 years in prison and a $5,000 fine. Next up, we have kidnapping, which I'll just pair these next to kidnapping and torture. Both of these would result in a life sentence at an extreme, which I was kind of debating whether or not to go with life sentences because, if it would be a little boring to just say life sentence instead of, like, adding to the numbers. But in the end, I was like, you know what? You can get multiple life sentences, like, in real life, I'm pretty sure. So I was like, why not? So yeah, kidnapping and torture, he would get a life sentence for both of those. Next up, we have poaching. This would result in a 15-year prison sentence and a $10,000 fine. Next up, we have citizens' rights violations. This would result in a 10-year prison sentence and a $10,000 fine. Alright, next up, we have grand larceny. This would carry a charge of 20 years in prison and a $2,500 fine. Alright, next up, we have embezzlement. Embezzlement, yeah. This would carry a charge of 3 years in jail and a $10,000 fine. Next up, we have slander. Slander would get him 1 year in jail and a $1,000 fine. All right, next up we have counterfeiting money. This is one of the bigger charges, though. I mean, by bigger, I mean, I feel like there's like a limit on these because a lot of the bigger stuff ends up being like 20 years and like 2000 or not 2000 $250,000 in fine, so there might be like an upper limit on these. But yeah, counterfeiting money is 20 years in prison and $250,000 in fine, like I just said. Next up, we have price gouging, which would be 1 year in prison and a $10,000 fine. After that, we have racketeering. This would be 20 years in prison and $250,000 fine. You know, like, that's what I was just saying about how I feel like there might be an upper limit on these or something. But, anyways. Next up, we have stalking, which is a half a year in prison and a $1,000 fine. After this, we have endangerment, which would be 1 year in prison and a $2,000 fine. All right, next up, we have piracy. And I mean, if you aren't expecting Mr. Krabs to commit some form of piracy, then like, what's wrong with you? I mean, his grandfather is literally a pirate, and he also used to be a pirate before selling his ship and firing his crew and getting into the restaurant business. But this would bring Mr. Krabs 5 years in prison and a $250,000 fine. All right, breach of the peace. This would be 1 year in prison and a $1,000 fine. Next up, we have parental neglect, which this one's a little weird because I don't really remember him committing any form of parental neglect, like with his daughter Pearl. So I'm not really sure this should be here, but maybe I'm just forgetting because maybe he did something weird in the newer episodes of SpongeBob. Because honestly, I haven't really watched the newer episodes. I'm kind of a classic, seasons of SpongeBob kind of guy. But anyways, parental neglect would get him 1 year in prison and a $4,000 fine. All right, next up we have mistreatment of employees and harassment. These two are kind of the same thing. Like, they would pretty much bring the same charge, so I'm just going to combine them into one. This would carry a half a year in prison each, one for SpongeBob and one for Squidward. And I'm not really assuming this is during any time where, like, either Pearl was a employee or Patrick was an employee. I'm not really counting it. Or, like, Jim. You guys remember Jim? Yeah, the old fry cook, yeah. I don't think it's during that. I'm pretty sure it's just SpongeBob and Squidward, so we'll just go with that. But like I said, half a year for both of them. Next up, we have vandalism. This would get 1 year in prison and a $2,500 fine. Next up, we have illegal machine operation, which this one's kind of weird because I'm pretty sure this is referring to the claw machine that he had, maybe? Unless he operated some construction equipment that he wasn't supposed to. But I'm treating it as if it was a charge that he didn't have the right permits for the claw machine operation, which this would actually kind of go under like a gambling, like illegal gambling charge, I think, or at least that's how I'm doing it. Like I said, not a lawyer. But yeah, so illegal machine operation or illegal gambling would result in a half a year in prison and a $1,000 fine. Next up, we have breaking and entering, which would be 1 year in prison and a $2,500 fine. Next up, we have attempted murder. Wow, yeah. It's kind of crazy. This would be our third life sentence that he would get. And that's the last one for life sentences. So, yeah. Next up, we have plagiarism, which would be 10 years in prison and a $250,000 fine. Next up, we have indecent exposure. This would result in half a year in prison, a $1,000 fine, and a required registry to the sex offender database. Database? Yeah, that's a word. Database. Yeah. So this is kind of like the only one that doesn't have a jail or monetary charge. Like, it has something else on top of it. So, yeah, there's a lesson. Not all your punishments will happen in the form of money or jail. Sometimes they throw extra stuff on there. And which is kind of brings up an interesting point. There's probably a lot of like community service or like parole stuff that would go with this too, but I'm not gonna go that deep into it. I'm just kind of going base level here. But anyways, yeah. Next up would be criminal destruction, which would be a year in prison and a $50,000 fine. All right. Next up we have food poisoning, which this is in the episode where that really fancy food reviewer guy comes to the Krusty Krab. And then he's like, oh, the sponge chef is, like, really good. He should be the face of the restaurant. And then Mr. Krabs makes the Krusty Krab literally SpongeBob themed. and he gives out spongy patties instead of Krabby Patties. But it turns out the spongy patties, despite looking yellow and green like SpongeBob, they're just patties that got left out and turned rotten. So, yeah, don't do that. That's not good, because it literally gave everyone food poisoning. Um, this would bring Mr. Krabs 5 years in prison, along with whatever damages the customers would sue for. But I'm not including that in there because it's not really calculatable how much, like, because we don't know if they would sue. Like, I would sue if I was in that situation, but I don't know if they would or how much. So I'm not really counting damages from customers into the total. All right, next up, we have battery. This would be a 1/2 year in prison and a $2,000 fine. Next up, we have smuggling. This would be 20 years in prison and a $250,000 fine. That's a very popular one on this list, is like the 20-year, 250,000 combo. So, next up, we got labor law violations. Because this is non-specific, I'm going to take it as like he's violating minimum wage law, because it is said multiple times that Mr. Krabs either pays SpongeBob and Squidward very little or he doesn't pay them at all, which is, like I said, and the reason I'm doing this list, outright criminal, because you got to pay your employees. So I'm taking it as a violation of minimum wage law. This would get him a $2,000 fine, $1,000 for each employee. No jail time with this one, as far as I know. And then the last one on the list, finally, we reached the end of the list, is slavery. Yeah. Oof. Yikes. This one would get him 20 years in prison. Not a fine, though. Just 20 years. Whew, we finally made it to the end of the list. So, to total everything up, Eugene H. Krabs would face 3 life sentences, 216, roughly, years in prison, and 2,013,250 worth of fines, as well as registering as a sex offender, so he wouldn't be allowed around any of the kids. Forgive me if some of these numbers are slightly off. You know, there's a lot of them to add up. So if you want to check my math, go ahead. And also, if someone's seeing this has a law degree, I welcome you to, bring more precise figures and, give a more precise number, because you would actually know if these charges are correct or not. Like I said, I just Googled stuff and I tried to get a close estimation, so this might not be exact. It could be a little more, it could be a little less. I'm not really sure. But once you have 3 life sentences, does it really matter? Like, everything on top of that is just kind of pointless at that point. Like, you don't really care because you already got 3 life sentences, so you're gonna be dead. So yeah, but it's just supposed to be an estimation. It's for fun, so I'm not trying to be completely serious here. But with that, thank you for watching. This took a really long time, like I said, longer than I thought it would, and thanks for being patient. And if you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe, and tell other people about the channel. Show them videos. It would really help grow the channel, because I think that'd be cool. Have a nice little corner here with some people on YouTube. That'd be nice. Very epic. Be very cash money of you. But yeah, that's pretty much all from me. I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye-bye!